Boy, what a weekend, huh? Well, we've had a couple of primaries already, and now this Justice Scalia news. Thought here on President's Day it might be apropos to talk about the president's race, and we got more to talk about as well. Professor Peter Wielhouwer, Political Science Department at Western Michigan University, is back with us this morning. Peter, good morning.
Good morning, Richard.
Thank you, sir, for the time again today.
Glad to do it.
So when we scheduled this, we knew by the time we would speak, we would have a caucus and a primary out of the way. Any big surprises, you think, in any of that?
Well, I think certainly Bernie Sanders' performance in New Hampshire kind of dashed the hopes of the Hillary Clinton campaign that she really could have made much stronger progress in the primary state that had been so friendly to her and frankly, to Bill Clinton over the years. So I think that was a big surprise. I think we've seen a few other minor surprises as the Republican field starts to consolidate itself. We've had several candidates drop out. It's now more or less a 5 or 6 person race. And so we're starting to see some of the undecided Republican voters start to consolidate into pretty much the Bush, Rubio, Cruz camp with a smattering of people heading toward John Kasich as well.
The New Hampshire thing maybe was good Clinton territory, but we're talking about Sanders' area, right? I mean, his state is right next door.
That's true. So he has the advantage of name recognition, especially because some of the media markets are shared up there in the north central part of New England. But I think that he really does have a lot of support from people who are independent-minded and who are allowed to vote in those primaries. And what we saw is that he had pretty strong support among independents as well as among very liberal Democrats. So he's got an interesting coalition. The question is, when we move to states where the rules are less flexible in terms of who gets to participate in the primary and the caucus, can he sustain that level of support?
Well, he keeps saying he can, and does it look like he could?
Well, I certainly think that he has the case, especially when we look at caucus states where the benefit tends to accrue to candidates with really excited, diehard supporters. I think that his real challenge will be navigating in states where there's a lot more diversity in the Democratic electorate, as many people have noted over the last couple of weeks. Once you move out of Iowa and New Hampshire, the demographics of the Democrats really starts to change quite a bit. And the challenge for Bernie Sanders is his unfamiliarity among many members of the African-American community, the Latino community, and so forth, in terms of his record that is not quite as familiar to them.
Should Hillary be worried?
Well, I think she is staying the course. She's working a plan. It's pretty clear from the contours of her debate performance the other night that she has found what she thinks is a really good message against Bernie Sanders. You know, in general, I think this is an interesting part of the campaign for both parties, because what we see is what passed for kind of civility and we disagree on some things, but we're mostly okay with each other. We've really seen the gloves come off. And so she's been quite pointed in her criticism of Bernie Sanders and his long-term, lifelong message against economic inequality. She's making the case that she's got a broader message.
Well, and this is what Bernie said he didn't want to do, was get negative, but it's almost as though you have to, right, at this point?
Yes, but you know, what one person calls negative, another person calls drawing contrast.
Yeah, right.
And so, in the campaign ethics literature, there's a really interesting debate going on between, how you think about campaign ads as drawing contrast, even when those contrasts are unfavorable to your opponent, and just simply going on the attack. It's really hard to draw the line on that sometimes.
Professor Peter Wielhouwer is with us from the Poli-Sci Department at WMU. We'll talk about the Republican side in a moment and the Scalia factor and all of the political talk right now. It's coming up. Peter Wielhouwer is back with us from the Poli-Sci Department at WMU. So on the Republican side, Trump hangs in there, though he didn't win Iowa.
That's true, but he was close, as he'll be sure to tell you, that it wasn't that hard, that bad a trouncing. Certainly in a state like Iowa, where the evangelical vote is tremendously important, candidates with broad evangelical appeal made their mark, and it gave them renewed life in their campaigns. and we saw kind of probably what is a better predictor or better measure of Trump's overall support within the Republican Party when we got to New Hampshire. That if we look at national polls and even polls in South Carolina, Trump seems to really be tapping into the frustration on the Republican side, but it also seems that his support really seems to be capped at about 35%. And so when we look at those other candidates, again, trying to consolidate their support and eliminate the weaker competition, we're starting to see that maybe Trump's appeal is not as broad as some of the pundits seem to make it out to be.
That's interesting. I didn't get a chance to play it this morning, but I saw it on social media. It was an interview that Trump submitted with Lester Holt, NBC. And the question, as it was phrased in text as I read it, was something along the lines of, is this a show? And are you going to be like this when you're president? And the response that they'd written there that he apparently said, I didn't watch the video yet, was, no, I'll be different. Can somebody this flamboyant and some say probably narcissistic, I don't know, can he be president and rally people across the world to be our allies stronger than they are now?
Well, I think the question is not necessarily can he be president, but perhaps can he be presidential?
Yes,
in the way that we've been expecting presidents to rise above the fray, oftentimes to not be so snarky, to not be so off the cuff and rude to people. And let's be honest, I mean, he's made his billions by being that kind of a person in the business environment.
Right.
I think that he probably does have the ability to exercise some self-control because my modest experience in the business community is that after a while people just won't want to work with you.
It wears thin, yeah.
And so I think that he probably does have that ability to do some self-regulation. But I think he's under the gun now. I mean, some of the national polls are showing a significant dip for him over the last couple of weeks. And, I mean, he's always been kind of a flamboyant but vitriolic person.
Yeah.
Tells it like it is, and now he's just starting to sound really, really mean and ugly. And I think that that's going to take a hit once you're getting in the states, for example, like South Carolina, where that tends to turn some of the Republican base off in a big way.
Who's his biggest threat? Ted Cruz?
It seems to me that right now Ted Cruz is his biggest threat. From an organizational standpoint, it looks like Ted Cruz has built very strong campaigns in multiple states, especially as we head into Super Tuesday on March 1st. So I think from an organizational perspective, a financial perspective, Ted Cruz is a significant threat to him. I think that you could see Kasich, any of the other major candidates, Kasich, Kasich, Bush, or Rubio, could also make the case. It depends on which of them stays in the race. If one of them drops out, then I think you'll see their supporters go toward probably one of the other moderate conservatives, I should say, rather than to Ted Cruz.
We're talking with Professor Peter Wielhouwer, WMU, here on WBCK. Back in a moment with more, and we'll talk about this whole Supreme Court situation, too, which really exploded over the weekend with political rhetoric. We'll get to that in just a minute. WBCK, Professor Peter Wielhouwer back with us again this morning from the WMU Poli-Sci Department. Boy, this death of Justice Scalia came out of nowhere, didn't it? Wow.
Wow, it was really unexpected. My wife actually forwarded me the link before I saw it on the news. Mm-hmm. My jaw hit the floor.
Yeah, mine too.
It was really just unexpected. He was not the first guy, I think, or first justice, I think, for people to expect to exit the bench in so precipitous a manner.
Right, that's right. So is a president obligated to offer a nominee?
Well, that is one of the authorities that the Constitution gives to the president. It clearly defines the president nominates somebody that the president believes to be a competent person, and then the Senate provides what the Constitution calls advice and consent, which for all practical purposes means that they hold hearings to evaluate the qualifications of the nominee and then hold a vote on whether to consent to this person being on the Supreme Court bench. And in fact, this is true for all federal judges, not just the Supreme Court.
Mm.
So it's very clear the president has this as his responsibility, his authority from the Constitution, and the Senate's responsibility is to hold hearings and to evaluate the candidate.
Yeah, but doesn't have to present necessarily a nominee.
Well, the president doesn't, but why wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Or she, I mean, it's at some point. But, I mean, why wouldn't the president fulfill that constitutional duty? And it certainly provides every president with the opportunity to shape future Supreme Court decisions that are binding on the entire nation. And it's certainly a very important position, and so there's no reason that a president wouldn't.
Yeah.
Certainly, being in the end of the year, it doesn't seem to me that would be something that would be by definition something to keep the president from putting forth a nominee.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing in the Constitution or the statutory language governing that, to my knowledge, that has anything to do with that.
So the Republicans, I guess Mitch McConnell might have been one of the first to step up this week and say, we really ought to let the next president decide this. That was just a statement that a Republican might be expected to say. We really didn't expect that to be the case, right?
Well, unfortunately, Mitch McConnell is saying the same, being very consistent with saying the same kinds of things that he said since the beginning of President Obama's term,
right.
And that is he's trying to deny him victories, deny him influence, provide him with opportunities for defeat, which is, reflective of kind of the sad state of Washington
right.
affairs in general.
Yep.
There, as we think through what the Senate's role is, essentially what this constitutionalist conservative wants to do is say we're going to kind of bypass what the Constitution says to do because we don't want to work with this president. That's more or less what he's saying.
But of course, if the situation were reversed, we presume, like you just said, why wouldn't the president offer up a nominee? I mean, if we had a Republican president, he probably would, right?
Absolutely, and I would certainly expect the president to put forth a nomination. There's absolutely zero reason to think that he would. That would be completely unprecedented in American history. Now, nominees being denied, being voted down, being withdrawn, that's a fairly common occurrence, especially in the last 50, really across the whole history of the Republic. But it's unreasonable to think that the president would hold off on that.
Mm-hmm. There was a Washington Post editorial yesterday, I think, that I saw, and if I'm understanding it correctly, the position that it came from was really, even if the president doesn't offer up a nominee, and like you said, why wouldn't he? But if he doesn't, the Democrats, if we want to be political about it, still really have a victory anyway, they said, simply because the lower courts are all sort of democratically focused, meaning Democrat Party. Yeah.
Well, I think that when you look at presidents who have served or parties that control the White House for a long time and have the ability to really shape the federal bench, and that's not my area of expertise, but in general, the longer a president serves, the more opportunities he has to appoint members of the federal bench who have all lifetime appointments. And so there is a really strong opportunity to build that court system and in an ideological direction and a constitutional interpretation perspective that the president prefers.
Yeah. So Obama offers up a nominee. It's going to set up a big fight. Do you think anybody will get through?
Certainly. Somebody will get through. There's no question about it. And some names have already been put forward. I think that we wouldn't expect for them to get through unless there's just unprecedented grandstanding by the leadership in the Senate. My sense is, though, that ultimately will not occur unless they themselves want to go against the constitutional process and unless that they want to do something that's unprecedented. The longest time gap in the history of the Republic between a president nominating a Supreme Court justice and that justice and a vote on that justice, not an approval, but a vote, was only 4 months, and that was in Woodrow Wilson's administration.
That was the longest?
125 days was the longest.
Wow.
So it's really unprecedented for Mitch McConnell to take the position that he did, and it'd be unprecedented for them to drag this out past the election. That would be unprecedented in history.
And it, like you said, it would seem unusual for a president to say, I'll pass.
And let's be honest, it would be foolish to do so. Why would a president? There's no rationale behind it aside from, we don't want the president to do this because we don't like the president and we won't like his nominees.
Right. All right. Well, as always, we appreciate the time, Peter. Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a good one.
Peter Wielhouwer, WMU Poli-Sci Department on WBCK.